The disciples gathered around Jesus and told him everything they had done and taught. And Jesus said to his disciples, "Come away to a deserted place, all by yourselves, and rest for a while." For there had been many coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. So they went away in a boat to a deserted place, but many saw them coming and going, and hurried there on foot from all the towns, and arrived to meet them there. And when Jesus went ashore, he saw the great crowd, and he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. And this little snippet from today's reading, in the Gospel of Mark shows us a moment where Jesus is taking compassion on his exhausted disciples. They have returned just recently from going out to various villages 2 by 2. They got the speech about shake the dust off your feet if the villages don't receive you, but go to the next one. And so they've been village to village to village. And now they're back and they're tired. And Jesus can look at them and tell, "You are exhausted. Go off to a quiet place and get some rest." It seems like they are giving him a report. But the disciples are as human as you and me, and when they came to a town that rejected them, I'm sure it hurt. Shaking the dust off your feet is a nice metaphor, but mentally and emotionally, it's a little harder. So not only are they physically exhausted, I imagine they are also emotionally exhausted. Maybe a little worn down. This moment in Mark reminds me of Christ's words in Matthew. "Come to me, you who are weary and carrying many burdens, and I will give you rest." Strangely enough, this passage in the lectionary has a gap in it. So if you look at your bulletin, you see there's a section of verses, they skip a bit, and there's another section of verses. It turns out the 2 stories that were skipped were 2 pretty famous ones. We have the bit about Jesus looking at his disciples and seeing how tired they are and wanting them to go to this quiet place, to be alone and to rest. And then we skip to this other part about how many people are approaching Jesus to be healed. But in between this moment, the crowd actually that beat them to that quiet place and prevented them from getting a lot of rest was the same crowd that Jesus fed with 5 loaves and 2 fish. So they were on their way trying to get a break, but there was this big crowd waiting on them, and Jesus not only didn't send them away, but made sure they stayed and ate. And after that, Jesus sent the disciples ahead of him in the boat, and he himself went off alone to pray. And the next story that is in between our 2 today, he meets them in the dark hours of the early morning, walking on water, terrifying them. So these poor disciples have had a rough day. An emotional roller coaster, we might say, for Jesus and his closest friends. Putting the stories together in context gives me even more compassion for the disciples, because it seems like most of this happened within a single 24-hour period. They come back to give their report to Jesus. He sees they're tired, tells them, "We're going to go to a quiet place." The quiet place is already crowded because the crowd beat them there. If you'll remember, the disciples kind of gently urged Jesus, like, "Okay, the sun's going down. Why don't you send this crowd home so they can have dinner?" And what does he do? "No, sit down. We'll find some food for you," and makes this miracle out of loaves and fish. It makes me wonder, did Jesus temporarily put his plan aside to let the disciples rest and recover in order to take care of this crowd who had met them there? And if so, I wonder how that made his apostles feel. He couldn't help that this crowd beat them to their place of rest. But he could have sent them away, and of course he did not. He fed them, made a miracle. I know Jesus had compassion on his disciples and wanted to give them a place to rest and recover. But I wonder if his compassion for this crowd, this sheep without a shepherd, was greater. The apostles had a shepherd after all. They had him, and he was going to still be with them. But these other people were still searching. And I wonder what the disciples learned from him that day. They were so exhausted, so ready to be out of the noisy, pressing crowds, just for a few minutes, ready for some peace. Instead, Jesus asked their help to create a miracle and fed thousands of people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And they did it, even though they were exhausted. And they stayed with Jesus, even though the crowds followed him or found him wherever he went. So peace and quiet was scarce, rest was hard to find, sometimes there was not even time to eat. This was one of the many sacrifices the apostles made when they chose to follow Jesus. Having a predictable life was out the window. Having a calm life was out the window. Even so, Jesus is constantly searching for opportunities for solitude, for prayer and rest, both for himself and for his disciples. Even surrounded by so many people in need of healing or food or compassion, Jesus still prioritized rest, renewal, and retreat for prayer. Today's gospel story reminds us that he wasn't always successful in trying to find those things, because crowds were always seeking him out. But Jesus never forgets to try to fit time in for rest. And so we too must also remember to prioritize rest and renewal and solitude and retreat for prayer. Many clergy go on a longer retreat once a year and then sprinkle in maybe days or half days for prayer and retreat throughout the year. Retreat simply means getting away from our normal tasks and our normal environment to a different, quiet place for the purpose of intentionally seeking rest and beauty and prayer. Retreat can be silent or not. I'm personally not very good at silent retreat. It can be solitary or not. Our own diocese has a place of retreat near the Huguenot called St. Andrew's House. And the Reverend Paul Rietman, who was with us back in June to talk about contemplative prayer, is leading a retreat there in late October. There's some flyers out in the narthex if you want to learn more. And a spiritual retreat for prayer and devotion is only one of many practices that we could focus on and prioritize for our own rest and renewal. Rest itself, I would say, is a spiritual practice. One that we might find particularly hard to prioritize in today's hustle culture. I have heard many people here at this church and elsewhere say, now that I'm retired, I'm busier than I ever was. How does it always happen that way? It's hard to prioritize rest and downtime because I think our culture teaches us that our worth is in our productivity. In the things that we do. What are we producing? What are we doing? Sometimes even the working culture presents exhaustion and being busy as some kind of achievement to be proud of. Working through lunch breaks or answering emails on vacation, which I definitely did last week. Because being useful makes us feel valuable. I've been there. There's also mental rest. How many of you have been glued to the TV or to the news on your phone? The state of the world is in upheaval these days. Constantly watching the news or reading updates because to stop paying attention can feel like a failure of some kind. And those of you who are parents or caregivers are very familiar with how it feels to sacrifice your rest for a person that you love, to care for them when they depend on you. You do it out of love, and it is also very exhausting. I had a counselor years ago who gave me a little card. And on it was a little cartoon drawing that you would recognize immediately if you've ever been on a commercial flight. And a single line of instructions that you would also recognize immediately. Remember, put on your own oxygen mask before you help those around you. And I stuck it on my desk for years, just to remind myself. Because we are not much good to the people we love if we don't take care of ourselves, if we don't rest. You can't pour water out of an empty vessel. So you have to remember to renew and refill yourself, to rest and recover. You don't have to earn the right to rest any more than you have to earn God's love. It is already yours, and it always has been. So on this Sabbath day, remember to rest. Remember to put on your own mask before helping others. Come to me, you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Amen.